So that was an Allegretto number 15 from Giuliani's Opus 50. Follow the lesson for free. We're going to be talking a little bit about bass muting and just the texture here and the counting. But if you're interested, I do have an edition of all 32 works in Opus 50, and there's a link for that in the description. So, like many of the pieces in this opus, there's a very clear upper voice, and so in this case it's fairly active. And always, with Giuliani, sometimes it's very clearly a melody or melodic material, and then other times he's kind of going through arpeggios and bringing us to a cadence. There's also a lower voice as well, which sometimes becomes active when the upper voice isn't doing too much. So you can work on those things separately and just make sure that you've sculpted them nicely. In terms of the counting, we have 6/8. So really, when you're feeling this, you're just feeling 1, 2, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. A strong beat on the 1, medium strong on the 4, and then the rest are weak beats. So you really just feel it in 2, right? So just make sure you really have that feel, and when you're doing the pickup, you want to be thinking in your head, da da da, so that the rhythm, you're in the mood of the rhythm before you start. 1, 4. Okay, and then one thing we're definitely going to talk about is the bass note rests, because Giuliani clearly writes in 8th note rests throughout a lot of the texture in the bass voice and the upper voice, but the bass voice mainly. And then there's a few sections where he doesn't. So it's pretty clear that he's not just writing it in for convenience or something like that. He actually wants you to mute the bass. I'll forgive you if you don't do this. It depends on your level. I think that everyone should practice doing the muting. When there's a rest in the bass in this particular piece, I think you should try to stop the string with your thumb and just get used to the idea of doing that and the technique involved. So make sure you actually learn how to do it. But if you actually don't do it in performance, I'll forgive you. I think that you should, though. It really depends on what level you're at and how comfortable you are and what you're going for in the piece. It's a little bit challenging, though, in this particular piece because the upper line is so active, and if you start picking the tempo up, it's actually pretty tough to mute it sometimes and get the next note in time. And I even noticed when I was doing it, some of the later basses, if you listen to the performance again, if I'm not mistaken, some of the later basses I mute a little early, actually. I got a little excited at the end, and so I mute them a little bit early, especially as I started kind of like, not speeding up, but pushing the rhythm a little bit. So that's something that you'll have to experiment with. Let's go over the first little bit and just experiment with that right off the bat. So a great way to practice this would be to go up to the note where the bass rest occurs, because you need to play that A and mute out the bass string with your thumb. So if you stop on that note, you can really tell if you've muted out the bass and if you've synchronized the movement of playing that note with the resting of your thumb back on the string. And then you can go on to the next one. I muted earlier there. Mute. That's why it's so important to do this, is that you can just accidentally mute it too soon. And then you can go up to the next one. So making sure that every time there's a rest in the bass that you can go up to the melodic note and just to double check if you're doing it correctly. And like I was just demonstrating there, my tendency is to accidentally mute it a little bit early. And that's a danger, is that you want to make sure it's a little bit more accurate. And so practicing the whole piece in that way is important. The rest in the upper voice I wouldn't worry about. I don't think the notes sustain that much, and there's so much activity in the lower voice that it's the bass voice that you should worry about. The upper voice, I think he's just not writing in ties for the most part, and I don't think you have to worry about the upper voice rests. So let's just do a small walk through the piece, but that's going to be for sure the main challenge of the piece is whether you include those bass note muting, and then just like putting it all together into kind of an exciting little piece that kind of moves. It's an allegretto, so it shouldn't go super fast. It's not an allegro. I don't think he's intending it to be super exciting, but it should be rhythmic and dancey and focused on that dotted quarter note. Here he sustains the bass voice right up to the cadence here. And then he begins muting it again. Sustain for the cadence. Nice little part. This is the section that I think I mute the basses a little early in the performance. As you pick up speed, you won't really notice a lot of the things. Like if I mute something early or miss a mute or miss a rest or something like that, you won't necessarily really notice it if you're presenting that upper line really smoothly. But nevertheless, it's when you're practicing the piece initially, go very slow and be very precise so that you can get the technique into your hands and that you're able to do it. The only other thing in this piece is a little bit of working out of some of the right hand fingering. For the most part, though, it's just fingers on the upper voice and thumb on the lower one. Sometimes when you have the activity in the bass, though, you can include the fingers. So at the beginning, so I go thumb, I, thumb, thumb. And whenever there's a arpeggio texture, I definitely go A, M, I in the upper voice. And like measure 4, for example, when you think about it, it makes sense to start with M there. M, A, M, I. So you're just kind of, most of the time you're just alternating your fingers in the same way that you would for a scale when it's a melodic passage. But when there's arpeggio figures there, you can really kind of like figure out what you want to do. I don't write I wrote like 1 or 2 right hand fingers, but for the most part it's pretty straightforward. And I wouldn't be too picky about what you're doing. There's lots of opportunities and rests and large spaces between the notes that you can start on whatever new finger you want to. So I wouldn't worry about it too much, but there's just a few spots where you want to kind of look ahead and make sure that you're doing that. Besides that, it's kind of a fun little piece, and one of the advantages to going through an entire opus of works, such as Op.50, is that you encounter these different textures, and then you have something to work on. This particular piece, number 15, throws a very specific type of texture at you that is very different than number 14, which is all this kind of Alberti bass arpeggio stuff. You switch over to this one and it's a very different texture, so it gives you something new to think about and new techniques to work on. And by going through an entire opus, you often are exposed to so many textures and pieces that you learn a lot of skills just by going through it. So just have fun exploring it and working things out. Don't be too picky, but when you're practicing slowly, be very precise, and then get it into your muscle memory, and then go to play the piece, and whatever happens when you perform it, let that be. But in your practice sessions, be very precise.